Okay, today we're going to be looking at Hero, which is the second poem by Siegfried Sassoon. What we need to really consider at this point is a comparison between this poem and Suicide in the Trenches, where we have the nameless boy and it keeps it very open-ended, whereas this poem specifically looks at Jack and what happened to him. So I want you also to consider, first of all, the title. So we have the title of Hero, and what we really need to think of is this title is quite ironic because it makes us ask the question, is Jack really a hero? And that will make more sense as we start to look at the poem in more detail. But when we think of hero, we do have, there are quite positive connotations. We think of someone who has shown great courage, who is admirable, and it's kind of a noble thing. And when we think back through different texts in literature, we see things in mythology where we talk about those heroes. So the title hero has always been something of a very positive statement. So what we need to think of though is what is being said in the actual poem. So we're going to start off looking at stanza 1, obviously. So we have here some direct statements by the mother and direct speech. And what this is this poem is set into 3 stanzas, and each stanza is telling a different part of the story. So first off, we have here the interaction between a mother who is reading a letter that has been sent to tell her that her son has been killed at war. Now, in this stanza, she's quite, proud and proud of her son, but that does change throughout the poem. But she has statements like this: Jack fell as he'd have wished. Now, we have there the euphemism of fell, because it's more of a pleasant word instead of saying, he died as he'd have wished. He fell, which is a little bit more pleasing in that way. But that statement implies that he died an honourable death. So she then makes a comment, which is something completely not about what's happening, but the Colonel writes so nicely. Now, what we need to think of is that, it's these personal letters that were sent by the more senior officers to let them know about what had happened. But then she, starts to, quaver and choke. So she starts to get a little bit upset. And then she makes this statement: we mothers are so proud of our dead soldiers. And what we see is this statement, it's kind of more of a sentiment as opposed to her actual true feelings, because it's very cliched. It's something that people would say a lot when, I'm proud. But where's the sadness? Where's the grief? It's not there, okay? And then we have her face was bowed. So there's a lot of negative emotive language here: tired, quavered, bowed. So we can see she's quite upset. But we move on into the second stanza where we see this definite shift, and we move from seeing the mother's perspective to the officer who actually brought the letter. So it wasn't the Colonel that would send the letter, it would be an officer that would bring the letter and let them know. So we have quietly the brother officer went out. He told the poor old dear some gallant lies, that she would nourish all her days, no doubt. So gallant lies. For while he coughed and mumbled, her weak eyes had shone with gentle triumph, brimmed with joy, because he'd been so brave, her glorious boy. So this officer is telling the mother all these lies, saying he's a heroic, honourable soldier, which isn't actually the truth. But the mother, she's, her eyes, they're weak, so we get this suggestion that, she's teary, she's upset, but they'd shone with gentle triumph in a fact that she was then happy because he had died in such an honourable way. So it made her feel a bit better. So we again have that repetition of, joy, and that goes across both poems. And so we can see, why is that word being used over and over? And the same here again. Why are we reusing that term boy? Okay, there's that innocence again, that youth, that these lives went, and didn't necessarily, show any true, life, you know, no life experiences really, because they went to war and then they died. So it's very, very tragic, and that's why we need to look at that idea of boy, is it brings out the tragedy. So then what we have in this final stanza is a revelation of the truth. What actually did happen to Jack? And we are a bit disappointed, okay? He thought how Jack, cold-footed, useless swine, had panicked down the trench that night the mine went up at Wicked Corner, how he tried to get sent home, and how at last he died, blown to small bits, and no one seemed to care except that lonely woman with white hair. So this stanza does have a lot of enjambment, so the lines do run along, and it doesn't quite end because it's trying to add some emphasis to this part of the story and some sense of urgency. But he panicked. Okay, he was useless, a useless swine, so a useless pig. Okay, and he, the mine, so when there's all these explosions and things happening, he panicked. So he then tried to get sent home. Okay, and then he died, blown to small bits. So we have then that alliteration, which Sassoon likes to use to really emphasize a lot of those more, the actions that are occurring. Okay, and no one seemed to care except that lonely woman with white hair. So we have again some alliteration, woman with white hair, and we have lonely. Okay, she's lonely because her son is gone. Okay, but what we need to consider here is the fact that he didn't want to be at war. He was a young boy and he tried to get out of it. And this happened a lot when soldiers went to war, especially those that were young, although it did happen to people who were older, and it was looked down upon by the other soldiers. Anyone who was cowardly and showed that they didn't want to participate, they got a hard time. And there were a number of soldiers who tried to injure themselves in a way that they would then not be able to come back. So the thought of possibly having a leg amputated or an arm amputated or having a very serious injury appealed to them as being a way to get out of that experience, out of that scenario, because they didn't want to be there. So they thought, well, and you've got to really understand that mentality, that it's quite, strong to have that thought. But for those that actually were fighting and had to stay, they looked down upon those people. The same as the persona in Suicide in the Trenches, he was seen to be very cowardly because everyone else has to stay. Everyone else has to remain and keep going. And there's a bit of a detachment and, the soldiers are a bit desensitized to death because it's so prominent in those scenarios. So it's quite horrific to think that, this would happen. But we've also got to look at then what happened when the family and other people were told. So they were told lies, they were told to make it proud because there was that public perception. And again, it's almost like showing this political statement that, you're telling these people whose children have died or husbands or brothers have died and saying that they died in an honourable way when they didn't. But you can imagine how that could affect the people, and you wonder why they told the lies in that way. But it definitely is something, and that's why people always had those things, we're so proud of the dead soldiers, he fell as he'd have wished, he was patriotic, he was doing the right thing, but unfortunately that wasn't necessarily how they actually died. So there we go.